Welcome everyone to the 37th Virtual Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. The one opening also our, what is this, our fourth year? Yes, we began in 2022. And this series is expected to continue throughout 2025, and then we'll see what happens in 2026. Um, but every year I just continue extending the lifespan of these meetings, and I hope that you're enjoying it as well. I am, as usual, your host, Joseph Portugal Alvarez from the University of Osaka. We actually just changed our name. It had been Osaka University forever until literally now. Starting this year, the institution have renamed itself the University of Osaka, so that's something I also need to get used to. And with us today, we have William Horncastle, who I will invite to introduce himself in a little bit. And he will be presenting about the excellent work that he has been doing mapping a regulation on political financing and referendum financing across the world with his colleagues, who his colleague is not able to join us today. Uh, but I'm sure we'll have enough questions and conversation to be had with Will. So I'm very much looking forward to that. If you have been participating in some of the meetings during the last year, you will notice that we're going a little bit more towards these aspects of lobbying and interest representation and political financing, which is something that had been missing over the last couple of years in this series. I was quite happy to come across Will's work, and he will also, I believe, be presenting some of the most most recent research that he has been conducting, and the paper that he has been working on that is not yet out. Now, before we begin, just a couple of things about how the session will be conducted. Again, this will not be anything new to those of you who have been joining us previously. So the session is expected to run until, well, I believe 11:30 Central European time. So we'll have about 90 minutes in total. The presentation or the session is not divided into two, with the presentation first and the Q&A, but rather if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please feel free to raise your hand, either on camera or hitting the little emoji, and then I will invite you to unmute yourself so you can make your comment and ask the question to Will. That makes for a more interactive discussion about the material being presented at the moment. I will also be probably interrupting Will a lot. I apologize ahead of time. I'll try also to hit the hand button so that I don't become too disruptive, just so you know, Will. Uh, so for anyone, the first time that you participate, again with a question, if you could just very briefly introduce yourself in terms of your affiliation and anything else that you would like to share with us about what your area of expertise is. Of course, this, as always has been, this is a community or meetings for people very much engaged with anti-corruption research or practice. But within this community, there's a lot of specific angles. So this has always been a good opportunity to do a little bit of network in terms of, people who share this interest on different aspects or approaches to measuring corruption. All right. So that's it from my side. Will, the floor is yours. So you can start sharing your screen whenever you want, and you can also start by telling us a little bit about yourself, and then you can go on with a topic.
Hello. So yeah, thanks for the introduction and apologies in advance. I'm not really a Zoom user. So can I confirm that my slides are showing okay?
We can see your slides, but we can see if you're using extended screen, we can see the secondary screen. So basically, we can
Ah,
see
okay.
kind of like the slide with the notes and the comments and all that. Yes, perfect.
Does that okay. Right, yeah. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's really nice to see, such um, a range of faces. I've not really met anyone here, and I must admit, I'm not particularly I suppose I'm not really an anti-corruption researcher. I'm a political finance researcher who kind of goes a little bit into corruption. Um, so there may be some bits of this that are a bit, I guess, uh, simple, but I wanted to kind of pitch it as as simple as possible so that we all are able to follow. So if any of it is a bit too sort of basic, I guess, yeah, I can speed up. My session is titled Comparative Indices for the Study of Election and Referendum Financing. So before I begin on research, I'll give a bit of background on myself. So I am Dr. William Horncastle. I am senior lecturer in applied social sciences at the University of Bedfordshire, which is in the UK, if you didn't realise. I recently finished my PhD in political science from the University of Birmingham, and previously studied at the University of Bedfordshire, sorry, doing criminology. So I have a background in sort of corporate crime, organized crime, and then that has sort of pushed me into this area of sort of financial flows and how that influences political decision making. I've held teaching and visiting positions elsewhere, and prior to my academic career, I was employed by charity World Vision, who many of you may or may not have heard of. They're not particularly famous here in the UK, for a number of years before beginning my research. So, as I said, I study primarily sort of money in politics, democratic institutions, and political parties. I'm keen on doing this from a comparative perspective. So, I don't have any particular case knowledge of Japan. So, hopefully, I can learn something from you guys as well. I mainly focus on Westminster style democracies. So that is like English speaking parliamentary democracies. And as part of my PhD and sort of the developments turning it into a book, I have sort of country and region specific expertise in Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the Caribbean. So um, not so much that sort of Asia and that region, but I'm happy to sort of hear any insights that you have. And I've published in journals and working on a book based on this research called Political Finance in Westminster Democracies. And yeah, that is my first book, so look out for that when it does eventually arrive. So I will quickly introduce my colleague Tuan, who, if in case anyone missed, has a back injury, so cannot make it today. So he is based in, I always get the pronunciation wrong. Is it Leuven? Leuven? With Walter. He's just finishing off his PhD now, but he's also has a visiting scholarship at University College Dublin. So he's sort of based in Ireland as well. And his focus is on referendum campaign spending by political parties in Europe. So from my perspective, I focus on the sort of elections and the general funding of day-to-day activities of parties. He's much more focused on the referendum side. So that's where we've kind of come together on this. So an agenda then for the rest of the session. As I said, some of this may be a bit simple. I've sort of developed it based on some conference papers I've given, some teaching I've done, So forgive me if it is a bit simple in places. I want to talk about first what I actually mean by political finance. Second, why we actually regulate it and methods of regulating it. And that will sort of bring us nicely into my data set, the Regulation of Political Finance Indicator, or ROPFI, ROPFI. I've never really decided how best is to say that. And then the referendum campaign finance regulation index as well. And then discussion at the end. So in terms of what I mean by political finance and what my research and data covers, it's quite a contested sort of definition. An early definition was just money for electioneering, but it's since become a bit more of a contested issue. So there's things like when defining political finance, should we be looking just at financial transactions, or what about donations in kind? So things like lending someone a car to travel to a campaign meeting or something, as opposed to giving them the money, you're lending them your car. It's kind of the same. Should they be treated as one and the same? Should the term relate to just candidates and parties, or should it also relate to third-party sort of campaigning organizations? And should it refer to all money given at all stages through the electoral process, or just in sort of election periods? So for me, in developing my research, I've come to view political finance as all financial flows to and from political parties, candidates, and third parties acting on their behalf, including formal and informal income and expenditure, as well as financial and in-kind contributions. So I look at this as a really, really wide-reaching topic, and that is just something to remember sort of as we go through. This is what I mean by political finance. So this is the sort of really simplistic bit that I said about. So forgive me if this is too simple, but the role that money plays in elections is a really important and quite complex one, right? So a lot of people assume if you have more money than your competitor, you're going to win, but actually it doesn't necessarily, there is no causal relationship there, right? It's not the money that causes you to win the election. It's the quality of the candidate plus the resources to allow that candidate to flourish. So one thing I always tell to my students, I'm a big sports fan. I love Formula One and motor racing, is that you can view it as like a motor race. So money is the fuel that goes in the cars. It doesn't impact the skill of the driver, but it does impact how far they're able to travel. So it is really important, and there are thus really important reasons to regulate it, and also important implications of different types of regulation. So money used in elections is used for many reasons. Advertising, campaign materials, production, research, data, consultancy, etc. We've seen in recent years a sort of professionalization of elections. Parties have turned from this sort of voluntary, stuff based on volunteer work towards a lot of professionalization, spending money on campaign managers, expertise, private sector organizations, etc. And because of this, money has become super important. The general trend worldwide has been that elections have been growing in cost. You only have to look at the US and the figures there that are like crazy, crazy money, billions and billions, right? So it is regulation is an important part of controlling that. And where the money comes from is largely dependent upon the political context, right, from within which the parties exist. Legal restraints are very much a factor in this. But generally, we can look to these areas on the screen now as sources of party income. So things like public funding, private donations from citizens or general individuals, trade unions, corporations, and membership fees. So, oh yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Will. So I have a couple of, well, actually one question, but with two examples. Well, this topic is so interesting, but so in terms of building data set, and I know that that's something that you'll be covering later.
Mhm.
It's already with the definition of political finance and dimension also, which I guess to a certain degree we could split between uh, political finance and the financing of elections and how that one belongs to the other. Uh, in the recent American elections, right? So, for example, we saw the situation where Elon Musk was giving prizes of $1 million for people, that were signing a petition for free speech, right? And it was supposed to function kind of like a lottery, but it was quite obvious that it had a very clear electoral motive behind it, right? Even though legally, I still don't understand how that could have been legally construed to be other than a campaign donation, but whatever, right? So I was thinking in terms of those type of cases and how they are classified from a technical perspective. So if you could shed some light on that aspect. And I was thinking also of a second example that is outside of the electoral process per se, which is that Mark Zuckerberg, right, the creator of Facebook, he has publicly also donated about $1 million for this inauguration event for the new Trump administration, right? So I believe that also is a political donation. It happens within the framework of the electoral process, but it's outside of the actual electoral event. So also, how do you classify that? Does it fit within the definition that you work with? Would it make it into a data set? So anything you could say about that would be welcome.
Is that okay? Um, yeah, so it's quite difficult, right, to talk about those sorts of cases because, in essence, and I think what you were kind of touching on there is they're almost designed to fit within these loopholes and kind of fall within the cracks of um, what we are attempting to regulate, right? And so I'm not a legal scholar or, I can't really speak to the minutiae of why things are legal and whatnot. But what I can say is that it kind of points to the difficulties with the target of regulations. There's often there's a need really to provide a balanced framework, right, that covers all aspects of the electoral process and, as you say, sort of election adjacent events. So regulation is often targeted at parties and candidates, but then there is sometimes a bit of a skepticism or reticence to extend that regulation to third parties that exist outside of the election. There's all sorts of reasons for that with, you know, arguments for free speech and whatnot. And, Elon Musk is very big on free speech, right? That's his whole shtick. So yeah, with regards to that, so my data and when I get to that, it covers quite sort of overarching themes of the regulation, but not so much those really um, like minutia of those types of things. So it will be able to tell you things like, how are third parties regulated?
Mhm.
Are they allowed to spend unlimited money for, campaigning on behalf of candidates and parties, etc.? But it doesn't tell you so much in a sense of, um, that specific activity would be legal here versus illegal here. I guess, there's been a bit of a trade-off between trying to get it as wide-reaching as possible, um, and trying not to sacrifice the detail, but also understanding that some of that detail has to be sacrificed to get a wide-reaching data set, to get what um yeah, so that's really, I guess, my response to that. But hopefully I'll be able to unpack more of that um when I introduce the sort of data that it is built upon.
Yeah, thank you. No, no, it's very insightful to hear your comments about this type of cases. Even though again the data set itself covers this in terms of broader motifs as you already mentioned. I imagine in terms of these third parties, we would be considering most obviously things such as political action committees, that sort of thing. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Great.
yeah. So third parties are kind of individuals or organizations that are not candidates or parties, but that seek to influence or, campaign in an election. So it's essentially someone that's not actually involved, but is doing it from an outside perspective.
Excellent.
Uh,
Thanks.
okay, brilliant. Um, so in terms of the need then to regulate political finance, and it kind of builds on that discussion we just had there a little bit. So it's often proposed for the following reasons. So to keep the costs of elections manageable, the US have done a very bad job of that. But where I live in the UK, we've done a fairly good job of that in having spending limits that are generally quite, with exceptions, but are quite well respected by individuals involved. We want to try to ensure that quality candidates aren't, kept out because they can't afford to run. Again, another thing that the US have been bad at. Ensure that resource inequality doesn't translate to political inequality. Ensure diversity, and I guess for the main reason that everyone here is interested in, to reduce instances of real or perceived corruption. And this is quite a sort of key thing for me, as someone who is not so much a corruption researcher. This may be something that's very simple to everyone else in the room, but I think, oh, but I think for me, the importance is not so much whether corruption is happening, which is very important, but perceptions of corruption and people thinking a system is corrupt is almost as damaging, as corruption itself. And you may or may not agree with that, but it kind of fuels the skepticism in government, reduces trust, and then we end up with, you know, um, all sorts of things like, again, the example of the US, like the insurrection and things like that. So legal frameworks are very, very important. So in terms of how things are regulated, and this is where I sort of started to build out my data set. It's based on the information from the International IDEA, International In Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. I think they are IDEA. They have this information on political finance regulations around the world. It's a 180 nation sample, and they have, I believe it's around 60 uh, 60 or so different types of regulations. So it will say things like, in Japan, do Japan have spending limits? Yes or no? Do they have requirements for donation disclosure? Yes or no? And it's kind of a data set that's built out like that. And contained within this are four main groups of regulation. So the first are what they call bans and limits on private income. And these are the things that essentially regulate the money that is coming in. So things like limits on private donations. There may be a limit on the amount one can give in a year or an election period. Um, Foreign donation limit or bans. So many countries obviously don't want to be subject to foreign interference, so they'll outright put an outright ban on donations from non-citizens or overseas donors. Corporate donation limits and trade union donation limits. Um, these are quite often, I suppose, politicized in a way. Left-wing parties tend to favor the corporate donation limits, but are happy to receive money from trade unions and vice versa. And as in all of these cases, different limits may exist for parties and candidates. And the reason for this is because it's I suppose it's easier for you to exercise undue influence from person to person than it is for me to give money to a party. It can get sort of lost in all of the other donations. That would be my crux as to why sometimes candidates are subject to tighter restrictions than parties. So we then have a group of regulations. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Well, so in your previous slide, could you say a little bit about if at all, if here we would also include concerns about or regulation about the period of electoral campaigning as well? Uh, because this is not my area of expertise, but as I
Mhm.
understand, there's an argument to establish certain limitations in terms of the period
Mhm.
before the day of the election that parties are allowed to campaign publicly. Again, also to disencourage the abuse in terms of the amount of money that is spent. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So you may have all types of regulation can be at an election period, um, based on the election period or based on an annual limit. So what you'll find is some countries may have regulations to say you can donate $5,000 per calendar year. And then when in an election year, there may be a 2 month election period where there is a different uh, a tighter regulation during that period. And this is often the case for things like, which I will get onto shortly, things around disclosure requirements. So if I give a donation, I believe in New Zealand, if I give a donation during the election period, it needs to be disclosed, like my identity and stuff needs to be disclosed at a shorter period of time than if it's just, during any other year. And it's designed to try and get that sort of enhanced transparency during the election period, where I guess, and again, I'm not corruption scholar, but I would assume that the election period is that bit where it's most susceptible to corruption and undue influence.
Is this also affected or is there a connection here with also state financing or funding of political parties?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah. So I'll get on to state funding shortly because that's on my coming slide. But yeah,
Okay.
state funding is also um, there's different regulations on state funding. So I'll hold off on a minute, but get back to that. So the second group we have, so we've spoken a bit about income into the parties and the candidates. The next group of regulation is all about outgoings, right? So spending limits designed to keep the cost of elections down and make things fair. So you can have things like a maximum spending limit in an election period, a maximum spending limit on a calendar year, and restrictions of spending on certain things. So in the UK, where I'm from, it's illegal to spend on TV adverts. So parties are not allowed to uh, buy, a 30-minute ad, not 30-minute, that would be, a 3-minute advert or something on TV, um, because we have public allocations for that. And this is again where we come into the discussions around sort of free speech and stuff. Some countries will have maximum spending limits on third parties. So one of the, I guess, easy things to do would be for if there's a limit on how much a party can spend during an election, they could spend up to that limit and then say, okay, we're not going to spend anything, but we're going to give some extra money to this guy over here who can spend whatever he wants on our behalf. So that's where the third party limits become important. Because if there's no third party limits, then I guess all other limits just don't really matter. Um, so these things are often indexed to increase with inflation, because as we know, when currency becomes less and less valuable over time, if you have a flat limit, it's going to have implications for the quality of elections and campaigning. So now we're on to public funding, which is a massive part of political finance. It is often studied sort of in isolation. Um, Quite a lot of the political finance literature focuses on public funding specifically, and less so on the private side of things, because it is quite a common thing. So there are many ways that public funding can be used. It can be paid on like a per vote basis. So you could get a pound or a euro or whatever currency based on the amount of votes that your party won at the previous election. It can be paid for as a reimbursement of what you've spent. So I, as a party, could spend, $1 million campaigning, and then the government may commit to giving me 80% of that back after the election. Things like tax deductibility on private donations to encourage people to donate their own money. And increasingly common are funding tied to certain goals. So we have things like gender quotas. So a lot of countries now will have, or an increasing number of countries have things like if you don't have a certain gender balance in your candidate list, then you will get a certain amount of your public funding withheld, or other countries reward you for having a more balanced representation. So there's plenty of ways that this all comes together. And yeah, so again, a lot of mention of the UK because obviously that's where I'm from. Indirect funding, so free use of premises, free uh, advertising space on television. And in the UK, we have this very specific thing that I don't think anywhere else has, although I may be incorrect on that, we have public funding only for the opposition parties. So there's this sort of tacit recognition that if you are the government, then you have these natural benefits of, being able to control the agenda. Opposition parties need more more resources to sort of counteract that benefit. So public funding is a huge part of it too. And the final thing is disclosure, oversight, and enforcement. The sort of key discussion with this and with, I guess, laws all the time, they're only as good as their enforcement, right? So if you have no electoral commission or no body specifically responsible for imposing spending limits, donation limits, etc., they're just not going to work. Like no one's going to actually adhere to them. So the data set includes things like this. So are there actually specific organizations in place to administer it? But there's also the key sort of aspect of disclosure and transparency. I'm sure you will have heard the phrase like sunlight is the best disinfectant to corruption. Transparency is a key part of any political finance regime. Disclosure of donations above specific thresholds are quite common. So the recognition that small donations aren't really going to, increase the risk of corruption, but larger ones will because there's that element of undue influence. So donations over £10,000 need to be declared as an example, just to make sure that we know who's funding what. And then, journalists pick up this information and the press and etc. So they're the sort of four real elements of political finance regulation. We've got the limits on the income, the limits on the spending, public funding provided by government, and transparency, enforcement, etc. And as I said from the start, all of these elements of the financing regime are contained within this data set by International IDEA. It's a very, very useful resource, and if you've never looked at it and you are researching this area, I definitely recommend you should, because it's really, really rich. But where it does kind of not suffer because it's not designed for this, but it doesn't allow us an easy way to compare regulations on a sort of a large N basis. So we can look at this data set and we can say, okay, the UK has this regulation, it doesn't have that one. Japan has this and it doesn't have that. But if we are, I'm like a quantitative researcher, that's not very useful for my regression models, having to put in, say, 50 or 60 different variables that are all just measuring one thing. So as a major part of my PhD, I set about designing something that would actually allow us to holistically represent the political finance system of a nation within a sort of single measure. And I appreciate, obviously, it's collapsing a lot of information down into a single figure, which has its limitations. But it's really designed to be kind of used alongside and in conjunction with this sort of qualitatively rich data set. So this is where my data, what I titled the Regulation of Political Finance Indicator, comes in. So I published this in 2022 in Electoral Studies. And as I said, it emerged from my PhD. It was developed to respond to a lack of consistency in the operationalization of political finance regulation as a variable. So what a lot of people were doing, and I say a lot because actually there wasn't really much large N research on this at the time, but what most people were doing things like adding up the number of laws as a proxy. So you would say Japan has 6 different laws on political finance. Britain has 2, so Japan must be more regulated than Britain. Now, there's sort of limitations to this approach in a sense that, well, the first thing is that it treats all different types of regulation as the same, sort of in terms of their impact. So 2 regulations will always have double the impact in terms of the overall system as one, which it may be the case, but it also may not be. So in response to these sort of issues, I set about developing something a bit more um, kind of robust. So in the past, some people had been producing single indices, sorry, measuring levels of regulation. But others had said, well, actually, what we need to do is look at these individual strands of regulation separately. So things like, the income, the outgoings, the public funding, and the disclosure all need to be on separate, measured separately. So what I did was I undertook some analysis that I'll come on to in a second that actually tested whether this was really required, how many dimensions were needed to actually fully represent the political finance system. And the spoiler is there was only one, right? I only needed one to represent the whole system. So um, yeah, I'll introduce more of that now. So as I said, it's based on the International Idea Political Finance database. My sample was of 180 nations, so it's about as expansive as you could possibly get, really. And it has data on 58 different types of law or regulation within these 4 areas that I discussed earlier. And the primary sort of underlying data is in a form of binary variables. So the example there being, is there a ban on donations from foreign interests? Yes or no? Oh, Balto, would you like to?
Yeah, maybe William, you're going to discuss that a bit later, but I would be interested in like the main trade-offs that you were dealing with. So what were the most difficult decisions that you had to make in um, reducing this wealth of qualitative data into like these very useful but parsimonious indicators, right? So it's always a very tricky exercise. I'm wondering what were like the most difficult decisions that you had to deal with. And secondly, what do you think is missing from the International
Mm,
Political Finance database right now? Because it exists for quite some time. It's updated from time to time. I've also contributed it myself, and it's not an easy exercise to do the actual qualitative coding, let alone then translate it into actual statistical usefully indicators. So I was wondering about your thoughts about this, like the back office of building such a nice
mm.
database.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I've never been involved in the International Idea database. And I guess my main sort of precursor is to say that number one, the International Idea Political Finance database is great for many reasons, but it's also almost too detailed in a sense, right? So what I've tried to do is go the opposite way to complement what already exists. So the main sort of problems, I guess, with the idea data and with mine, because it's based on the idea data, is because, as you say, it's routinely updated, but it's not like regular. So it's not like every year or every second year or whatever. So it's difficult to trace real-time changes in legislation. Now, the other, I guess the flip side to this would be that changes in political finance regulation or major changes don't actually tend to happen that often, is from my understanding, from my reading. So they are, I don't know how valuable it would be to have every single year, if the effort would be worth it. But certainly more real-time um, updating would be unrealistic, but also in an ideal world, right?
Yeah, you can think about, like, for example, the varieties of democracy
Mm,
index, if you know it. I mean, that is incredible if you look at
mhm.
how it is coded for each single year. If
Yeah.
that would exist for political finance, that would be great. But you're right, that it doesn't change every
Mm,
year, but it's not always clear exactly if if it is really the most recent data that is included
mm.
in the political finance database to begin with. And that's yeah, that's an issue. It's so difficult simply to track the changes all over the world in terms of political finance. It's almost an impossible exercise.
Yeah. And I mean that is, I guess it's one of the pitfalls of trying to be so widespread, right? So there's, for example, in there, I'm pretty sure there are like the Marshall Islands and Micronesia and all of these countries where I've tried, and actually in the second discussion on the second data set, um, we tried tracking down stuff that just, it was impossible to get there, right? A lot of countries, I mean, I don't know where everyone in the room is based, but certainly in the UK, and probably in Belgium and Japan, right? The government is always updating websites. I can go on and find parliamentary debates from yesterday, full transcripts of it, right? So in certain countries, it's much easier to trace these things. But when you're trying to get a fully global look at stuff, technological limitations are there. And I don't, I think a lot of people are not necessarily so convinced with the value in studying this. I think a lot of political finance researchers have been banging their heads against the wall for years and years, right? Trying to get this stuff, trying to get good data because we're often relying on proxy indicators and stuff. So I guess what I um with this data set, and I'll get on to the more of the methods shortly, but it's trying to start a dialogue and start a an agenda for more research in this area. It's not perfect. It's definitely not perfect for many of the reasons that Walter has said about, but it's hopefully a step towards further research. So I think, what time are we on? Right. I think I should speed ahead slightly with um, some of the methods, and then I'll go through. I'll have a quick sort of look around the website where the data is to show you some findings on there as well. So stage one of this research is a technique called multiple correspondence analysis. And I'm not sure who is familiar with a much more common type of analysis called principal components analysis, or factor analysis. It's all about like getting all of this data and reducing it down to its kind of core dimensions, right? So it's designed to take all of the variability in those individual variables and see if they're actually represented by something much more simple. So what we find here on the right is an image from the paper that shows the positioning of countries quite nicely across a horizontal dimension. And the kind of initial results there showed that the most regulated country in terms of like on the books regulations is Mexico. And the least regulated is Belize. And what you'll find here is if you look, in fact, actually, it's on the next slide. There are nice clusters within the data. So I took this dimension and then I applied a technique called model-based clustering to it. And what this does is it looks for identifiable patterns within the data. And it does this thing called soft clustering. So it introduces a kind of element of uncertainty between the clusters. So it says this case is clustered within this group, and we are very certain of that, or we're not very certain of that because it lies kind of halfway between the two. I don't know. Oh, yeah. Do you want to
Yes.
jump in?
Sorry, well, just so that we can all read properly the graphs. I believe in the previous slide there were two dimensions, and I imagine so in the x-axis the dimension was de jure. Is that correct?
Yes, sorry. So this dimension is only, so if you look at the, I don't know, can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Yeah. So here we have this horizontal dimension represents 88% of the variance in, variation in the data. This one here represents only 2.3%. So it doesn't add much at all. So this is probably not actually a very good way of visualizing the data, but this is how I did it when I published the paper. So really, it should be a single dimension. You're just looking this way, not this way.
Are
Does
those
that make sense?
dimensions a result of the analysis, or is it something that you establish a priori?
Yes. So the way the analysis works is it there is the same number of dimensions as there are variables.
Okay.
And what it establishes is that actually the first dimension is where all of the information is. All of the rest are just unnecessary.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, the further you move this way, the further the more regulated a country is in terms of it has many more regulations and more regulations in common with the other ones that are next to it than these ones down here.
Mm-hmm.
So the position of the points, when they're very close together, it means that their entire system is very similar. They're in a sort of similar level of regulation. And this is where then clustering,
Mm-hmm.
you have three main groups. You have one over here, which is what I call strongly regulated, one here in the middle, partially, and one very small one down here that are unregulated. And I guess I can come back to more of the methodological stuff shortly if there's any more questions. but I just want to make sure that I've got time to actually go through some more of the trends in the data because I have been quite slow to this point, right?
No, thank you. I mean, just with that brief explanation, it clarified most of the question that I had in my mind.
Yeah,
Eh,
brilliant.
at least in terms of how we should be looking at this graph and
Yes.
probably looking from left to right and then the
Yeah.
division into categories. That's great. Thank you.
So the one more thing just to mention here is you see what this image represents is on the right-hand panel, all of these ones that are quite dark are the ones where the model sees them as quite uncertain. So it doesn't know whether to put them in this category or this category. So alongside my data and classifications, there is like a p-value as well that says this is in this group to a 80% level of certainty or otherwise. So the three types of system are unregulated, which is a very small group, which I'll get onto shortly. But there's no substantive regulation of political finance. Where these controls do exist, they rarely extend beyond a ban on vote buying or a rudimentary form of indirect public funding. Oftentimes, these cases they'll say they have public funding, but they don't actually budget for it or really give any out. It's just there. And vote buying is just a very common regulation that pretty much every country has, at least on the books, right? So then we have partially regulated and strongly regulated, and these are just, I guess, extensions. It's like building up, right? So partially regulated have some controls, strongly regulated have quite extensive controls. And where we actually house the data and we can look at things is this website that I developed called www.ropfi.com, Ropfi, whatever, where there is a page to download the data. But if you would like to use it, I'd actually be really interested to hear if you do want to use it, how you use it, or any recommendations would be great. And there's also some sort of interactive visuals there. So if I click through, can I share? How do I do this?
I think if you share you need to share the tab or the window where you are opening the website.
Is this
Right now
showing?
we're seeing the regulation of political finance indicator.
Brilliant. So this is the website, right? And I'm not going to go through it in too much detail because, time constraints. But we have some tabs up here. So there's information about the project and the methodology and things here. And there are some visuals on here. So you can sort of explore the data. So you can show that up here, Mexico, Chile, Lithuania, Poland are all very highly regulated. Down here, Belize, Bahamas, Grenada, St. Kitts, Vanuatu, etc. There's FAQs about the project, but also please email me if you're interested in it because I'd love to chat with you. And here we have data viz. So there's some quite simple things, donut chart, but I also have an interactive map here that shows the global state of regulation. It's also worth noting I'm not a web designer or anything, so there may be some errors with the website. I did it all myself, but hopefully it gives you an idea of some of the trends. So, oh yeah,
Robin had a question in the chat. It's also something that I was wondering. Immediately, I guess a lot of us start thinking about how this data set or this result would correlate with corruption indices. And so Robin is asking if you have correlated
Mhm.
this data with any of them, CPI, for example.
I'll come on to that very shortly because I have, and I do that in the paper. Hold on, I'll switch back. Sorry for my um,
Not at all. Take your time.
my technical. Is that now the correct way around?
Could you swap this place again? Perfect.
Are you seeing that now? Yep. So brief sort of look. This is the global picture. Um, we have green as the most regulated, blue as the medium, and red as the unregulated. Um, I'm not very good with my countries, but I believe this is Central African Republic. This is Switzerland, which should probably surprise no one. Um, and I I don't know my Latin America and Central. So yeah, there's some more there. But if we look at continental trends, what we find is that so yeah, I guess where to start here. So Asia, we'll start with Asia because we're Japan. Asia is the only continent where there is no unregulated nations, but it's divided fairly evenly between the strongly and partially regulated. Europe is the most regulated continent generally. Um, and if we're looking at Oceania as a regional continent, that is where most of the unregulated nations are. Oh, and in the American, sorry, the Caribbean and Pacific, these sort of small islands, is where the regulations are um, least stringent. And then I wanted to break down the regional trends in Asia and the Pacific. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick point there, because I find the results so interesting. It reminds me of some work that a colleagues and I did a couple of years ago about evaluation of the extent of anti-corruption regulation in the Americas. And we found that the Caribbean were lacking a lot of it.
Hmm.
And the working hypothesis that I have since then is that it relates more with the size of the state and state
Hmm.
capacity as well. And seeing here for Shani as well, I do wonder if the issue is with the small states not investing as much in terms of updating the regulations. Yeah, that's something that I wanted to mention.
Yeah, so it absolutely does seem to be that. Another thing is that some research that I'm doing is focused on the kind of role of like governance practice, like the relationship between governance style and funding regulation, and the differentiation between kind of nations that rely more on kind of clientelist practice versus more programmatic styles. And a lot of that is in the small states, right? So it's very personalized form of politics, and as you say, state capacity and things. So there is definitely an association with population. Um, so I'll jump through these so we can get onto oh, yeah, question. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Just a quick question. I've got a few more, but on terminology, when you say strongly regulated, do you actually mean well regulated or heavily regulated? Because there is a big
Mm.
difference. And
Yes.
or I got getting.
It's not a sort of normative. It's a strongly being highly, not necessarily good or well. So it's more, there's a lot of regulation, but I don't make any claims as to whether it's actually implemented or,
Yeah.
sorry?
But so you don't make any claims that it could be implemented well or enforced well, but there is an underlying claim that the laws are good, are appropriate, or just that there's lots of,
Yeah. So it's, I guess, fully
because they could be ineffective,
regulated or,
right? Like, could be lots of
yeah.
ones which are actually competing against that are ineffective at actually delivering a strong election system.
Yeah, that's, I guess it's poor terminology from my end. It's about the strength in terms of body, like how much there is. Um, but yeah, it's by no means saying this is good and these ones are less so.
You could take two. You could say it's over regulated
Absolutely. Yeah.
in certain circumstances, and some would say it's underregulated in other.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you know if it's overregulated or underregulated or appropriate?
Yeah.
Is it delivering the outcomes that you're trying to achieve from the regulation?
Yeah. And I think that from my perspective would be quite a context specific thing. So some people would say, in some nations, for example, corporations, trade unions have quite a big influence. Some might say, okay, we need to sort of regulate them more to reel them in a bit. Others may say, well, actually, it kind of comes down to free speech and sort of philosophical debates, right? And there's also things around different types of electoral system, proportional or first past the post, like the laws interact with different institutional configurations in different ways. And that, I guess, is one of the things that this data could be used for in a future study. But it's certainly not anything I've fully explored.
I guess it's a bit like Robin's question. You overlay this regulation severity or severity index with corruption indices. That'll give you a sort of, is there a relationship between this and that, or the relationship with democracy, or different sort of outcomes that can be used? I'm personally interested in this sort of information because my area is in the cost of corruption, and we're looking for sort of risk indices of the risk of corruption in the election system.
Yeah.
And this looks like something that might be useful to be applied, but I think I'll need more to understand it better to see if it can be applied as a risk indicator of what's going on in the wider election system.
I would say in some instances it could probably be used more of like a control variable in a sense of measuring variation of how much regulation there is. But
is there a way to turn it into a risk indicator?
Short answer is I don't know, because it's not really my area, corruption, risk, and whatnot. But to be honest, I'd be really open to ideas. And if anyone has any ideas for that sort of thing, using it in specific ways, I'd be open to chatting.
I'd very much be interested in having a conversation after this, but about application, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, definitely we'll follow up and discuss it further, because I think it sounds like it could be beneficial to all, right? To have, and I guess there's a similar problem in the political finance literature that I've been trying to sort of solve in a way, or go some way towards solving, is that there is a distinct lack of data. So people are using these proxies that don't necessarily measure what they want to measure. So I will move quickly on to the next slide because it does answer some of the discussions that we've had. So in the paper, I did some analysis, some very brief analysis of what is it that kind of seems to explain different institutional sort of configurations of political finance system. And what I found was countries of English legal tradition tend to be less regulated relative to countries of other traditions. And this aligns actually with there's this notion of sort of British exceptionalism in political finance literature. Britain stands out as an exception to Europe, which is quite heavily regulated and with public funding. In Britain, we don't tend to do much of that. Countries using proportional systems, electoral systems, tend to be more regulated than majoritarian ones. And the discussion, the sort of thoughts here are that there tends to be more parties, right? Proportional systems tend to be more multi-party. So the parties then kind of favor regulation and public funding to keep that alive, right? And this is the one that everyone is interested in. So countries with higher levels of corruption tend to be more regulated relative to those with lower corruption. This is, and forgive me because I can't remember which measure I used. I believe it was the World Bank one. Is it World Bank control of corruption? And I think the difficulty here, and I guess some of you may be able to have your own opinions on this. The difficulty I have is, number one, my measure is like cross-sectional, so there's no element of time, right? So there's no way I can look and say they introduced these regulations and then corruption was reduced somehow. There's also the explanation that countries with high levels of corruption then go, actually, we need to do something about it, so let's introduce the regulation. And there's a reverse causality relationship there. Or there's the third explanation that maybe regulations and things are used as almost like they're put in place to see that we're doing something, but actually we don't really follow them and we just carry on as we are. To be fair, I'd appreciate if, I'd like to hear anyone else's thoughts on that if they do have any on that relationship, because that was quite a robust relationship and it's something that has been held through, other people have studied and found as well. I think the crucial thing is the time element to it. So, I see people nodding. So I suppose that's an important part of corruption research, right? And the final thing, populations, small states tend to be much less regulated than larger states. That came out in the sort of descriptive trends. And yeah, it could be explained by governance, state capacity, all sorts of things. So yeah, they're the patterns I found in the paper. So yeah, do you have a question, Joseph?
Yeah, just to add a comment about this correlation between corruption and regulation. That potentially also an issue here, and that's something for the rest of us to to think about how we can resolve it, is that indices such as the control of corruption by the World Bank are catch-all in terms of corruption, right? Because it tries to catch all forms of corruption. Whereas the most significant type that we should look at in terms of correlation here is basically political corruption, right? And a lot of softer forms of money politics, lobbying, and these sort of things that tends to happen a lot more in the global north compared to, well, not compared to, but In the global north, we see a lot more of that sort of influence of business and money in politics, without it being mixed with administrative corruption and investment and that sort of thing, is that we don't have disaggregated data for that. So it might be an issue that, yeah, the control of corruption is not the right index to compare it to, on the one hand. So yeah, I mean, they are the hypothesis that you presented, they all sound very likely as well. But I think that refinement in the other data that you use for that analysis would be needed as well.
Yeah, sure. I'll quickly respond and just say, yeah, it sounds very good. And I mean, if anyone is interested in, trying to correlate it with other forms of corruption indicators and seeing where it goes, then I'd be really interested in hearing, what your findings are. So I think there's other questions. I don't know who.
Yes, we have a question by Dieter and David, or the other way around. I don't know who
Yeah.
raised.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. Actually, I just want your insights. It's quite surprising that there are countries that that have no regulations. So because it looks basic that almost all countries should have some sort of regulation to regulate what comes into finance politics. Then secondly also I want your insight around effectiveness. I know it is not covered within your study, but I just want your insight around how do you think these regulations are effective? Because we can point to countless examples all over the world where finances or PAG system they could fund through third parties and stuff like that. So I would like to hear your insights on this.
Yeah, so I'll take the first comment. So if I go back, so it was actually quite a surprising finding to me as well, as you said, that most countries tended to have at least some form of financing regulation. Those that had nothing were very much in the minority, and I guess were hopefully explainable at least in some way by the what I said around small states, capacity and whatnot. But it was not really that surprising that Europe was the most heavily regulated place. I think that is down to the sort of tradition of public funding. So there's a lot of public funding in parties there. And that was essentially what happened was it began in Latin America. Public funding of parties was originated there, then came over to Europe, and it's been sort of spread around since then. So yeah, I mean, with regards to the countries that aren't regulated at all, I can't really explain a lot about why there's this sort of band here of blue, but then a red in the middle, and perhaps there's more room for further exploration of this in future. And I guess that onto your question around effectiveness, it's a difficult one really, because I think again it comes down to being quite context specific, the effectiveness. So I think the effectiveness of this political finance regulation is highly dependent on other areas of sort of institutional development. So things like anti-corruption regulation, things like transparency regulation with regards to public officials, and yeah, it just interacts with all sorts of other things. So I think budgeting and general sort of financial health of the country, right, comes into it. But then there's also political motivation and desire to actually make sure that these things work, because certain contexts, and again, I would assume, looking from an outsider on corruption research, that those nations where corruption is like commonplace, a lot of that is down to the wider well, partially the institutional kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Inefficiency, but also down to like political will, right? So I assume there's similar trends, but yeah, they're just my sort of rambling thoughts right now.
Dieter?
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really very, very interesting. I just wonder if there's another two sets of variables that might help you explain what you find. And I wonder if you looked into those. So the first one would be in contrast to election regulation, referenda are really different beasts in different countries, right? So is there like a data set on the legal status and the position and relevance of referenda in the policy process? Are they reactive? Are they proactive? Are they binding? Are they consultative? So this kind of whole apparatus of like legal attributes and the position, the policymaking process of referenda could probably explain a lot of the regulation as well. And the second set is then around the empirical use, right? How do we know how frequently are they used? Like who is initiating, what type of stakeholders are initiating referenda? In the US, it's mainly corporations using those things by now, right? It's like not citizen groups anymore. I wonder how this is like in different countries. So those two, like the legal attributes of referenda and then the kind of the empirical footprint, I think those two sets of variables probably would help you explain a lot of the variation you find. Or maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, they're really interesting insights, and unfortunately, my colleague Tuan would be able to definitely respond to those much better than I can. He's the referendum guy. I'm the more election focused. But I guess I don't really have any sort of response to say that, yeah, it could be possible to look at, because there are data sets out there that look at kind of, and I think it's again from the international idea around the role of referendums, who can, initiates them, are they binding, etc. So there is a full data set on that that I guess we can unpack and look at. But yeah, interesting suggestions, and I'm sorry I can't really answer much further than that.
We also had a question from Obi, if Obi is still interested in asking it or a comment. I think he's not here. Okay, sorry. I think we can proceed.
Okay. So I wonder then, like, so I've not touched the referendum data at all yet. And is it coming up to the sort of end? Like,
I mean, it mostly up to you. I don't want to take too much of your time, but if you are okay with maybe I mean, as much as you need, really.
yeah, I can carry on. I didn't know if it was a strict timing sort of thing.
No. I mean, I'm still here.
Okay, brilliant. So I'm going to go over the referendum data, but again, this was the part of the presentation designed for Tuan to give. So forgive me if it's not, very polished or whatever. But what does all this mean for referendums, and why is it important for referendums? Right. So scholars in the field acknowledge the importance of political finance regulations for similar sort of reasons that I spoke about from the outset of this presentation. Things like voter competence, making sure people are fully informed on the issues, battling corruption, and creating this so-called regulated equality. So using regulations to make sure things are relatively even and sort of fair, I guess would be the terminology. So the idea of using finance and regulation in the referendum context is to ensure that both sides of a campaign receive equal opportunities to present their ideas, their arguments to the voters. Because as we know, and as discussed, if you don't do that, there's no fair and democratic procedures, and you have these potential for biased results. I'm sure you will have seen many examples. Certainly, I have, of referendums where it's like 100% turnout and it's 99% in favor of one side and then like 1% in favor of the other, right? So it's about trying to ensure that the questions being answered are actually asked, sorry, are presented well, expressed well, and campaigned fairly. So this is hot off the press. It was published like 3 weeks ago, maybe. So this is the second phase, the sort of development of my original data set into a referendum-focused data set. So we call this the RefCFRI, so the Referendum Campaign Finance Regulation Index. And it focuses on campaign finance regulation in 143 countries. So the reason that we do this, and the reason that it's fewer than the 180 nations of the other data set, is that not all nations use referenda, and our sampling strategy was designed to kind of be as wide-reaching as possible. So if you look at the top here on the right, we define referendums as mandatory, elite, or citizen-initiated national popular votes. And the countries are 143 UN members, where they have legislation that allows for national referendums, or they've had one in the past 50 years. So we try to give the kind of, again, holistic approach to get as wide a sample as possible. In this instance, so in the previous data set, I was able to use the international idea data and develop from that. For the referendum side, there was no such data available. So there's never been any data set put together around political finance in the referendum context. So we had to develop our own questionnaire survey that was highly inspired by the international idea data. So in this instance, we have 39 questions that concern the presence or absence of specific regulations. Again, they're similar. So are there donation limits? Are there spending limits? Do they have to report on finances, etc.? We did data collection together, the two of us. It was quite intensive. We went and found all of the primary legislative resources between January and April 2024. So we went to Tuan put together the list of countries, and then we went through every single one and looked at their legislation and read through it, which was very, I guess, we got a paper out of it and we've had this interesting research, but at the time it was very intense, right? So we have 40 nominally coded variables, so yes, no, etc. and our data set relates to political parties and other campaigning actors. So organizations that are established for the purpose of campaigning, for or against the referendum question. So I'm from the UK. We had a pretty big one, Brexit referendum. We have the political parties campaign on what they want, but then we also have official campaign groups that are set up just purely for the purpose of voting yes, voting no, and campaigning on those basis. So we focus on parties and these other actors. And again, we focus on private donations, which is missing from there, spending, public funding, and transparency. And we have similar sort of data structure as the international IDEA data. And it's the same, exactly the same method, right? So we took the data was in a very similar format. We applied the exact same analysis to it. And so I won't go through it in too many details, but essentially we had all of the yeses on one side, all of the no's appear on the other side. And these clusters essentially mean that whenever a country has some regulation, they tend to have regulation in other areas as well. And when they have no regulation in a specific area, they have no regulation in other areas too. So there again was this natural more to less regulations. And this is the better and more clear visualization of that. So each of these lines and down here represents a country from the data set. And this is our singular dimension. So down here we have nations that are completely unregulated and have like nothing. Up here we have very, very highly regulated. And in the middle we have sort of a below average. So we've made up these sort of general categories. And what we find is in the unregulated category, so those where there's really nothing, we have 19 countries, 5 from Africa, 1 from Asia, 6 from North America, and 7 from Oceania. So we have a similar pattern in a sense that those small nations are very light touch on their regulation. And we have in the below average category 68 and above average 56. And what we find is actually the most regulated are Armenia, Liberia, and Romania. I'm not very good with my ISO codes, so you may see what these are. But if we're interested, Japan is slightly below average. It is somewhere around here. No, I can't see it, but yeah. Essentially, there's a spread across them. Yeah, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I was wondering. So I'm going through the list, and I mean, first of all, it seems to be quite a mixed bag, right? In each one of these categories, there doesn't, at least at first sight, seem to be a connection between being above average and being considered normally a country with a clean and efficiently run administration, right? Because I'm seeing here, I mean, what is the Russia, Colombia, and Kenya, Serbia. Of course, Canada is around there, but you have Venezuela and 2 positions later, Chile. It's quite mixed, right?
Mhm.
That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so I don't really have many insights into what could be the reason for these, positions, but I wonder whether the sort of variation and the mixture, um, and this goes back to the question, sorry, I can't remember who it was that asked it,
Dieter?
in relation to the function of referenda and whether they're legally binding and not and whatnot. I wonder whether these categories have any bearing at all on the relevance, regularity, etc., of referendums, um, uh, in general political processes. Now, I don't actually know anything particularly about referendums. Tuan was the guy for that, but I'm just sort of I guess thinking aloud whether that would have any bearing on things. Um, but yeah, it, as you say, it is quite mixed. But then there are in the unregulated, there is that pattern again of Caribbean, Pacific, there's definitely a pattern there. I'm not sure how interesting that is of a finding, but I think those smaller countries tend to be a bit more light touch on the regulation. Whether that's because they're more personalized, politics wise, there's a more of a role for like informal institutions and whatnot. But yeah, that's essentially my thoughts on that. Um, so uh, I don't have an awful lot more to say about the referendum data, other than to say that the data is available. This paper has just come out. Um, Unfortunately, this one isn't open access. So the original one is, but if you do want a copy of this, then just feel free to contact me, or I can send it to Joseph, and he can circulate it if that's good. Um, but yeah, the sort of general conclusions, I guess, for both um, both data sets are that we've tried to develop sort of methodologically robust measures to focus on campaign finance regulation. We think isn't this isn't the end. We think we very much see this as a start point for developing further. And we definitely are committed to doing that and really want to do that. So if anyone would have any interest in helping with that process, at some point I need to basically try and get some money from somewhere to do more of this. But if anyone has interest in collaborating, please do get in touch. But we see that our data in its current form has some useful uses, right? So with regards to our referendum data, the qualitative element of it, so this survey that breaks down individual regulation types, can have a very similar purpose to the idea data that's already out there. Practitioners, lawmakers can look at it, see what already exists, and maybe areas for development. And the quantitative measures can be predictors or outcome variables in statistical analysis. Again, we can really try to explore this link with corruption further. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, so just to confirm, the data set that accompanies the paper, is that disaggregated at the level of the of indicators?
It's only one holistic, like the whole system. Do you mean the referendum one or the
the referendum one? Because so it has 40 indicators, right? Um,
so they are just yes, no questions.
but do we have columns for each individual indicator in the data set?
I'm not sure if they're actually in the Excel, but the download, but we can definitely add them if that, because that would make sense. I can come back to you on that and
Okay.
um,
I
that
was asking because
the
if,
data is available.
if anyone within this call or the anti-corruption community would like to perhaps consult this data set either in collaboration with
Mhm.
your team or separately, because potentially there also an argument to correlate certain indicators that may make more sense from an anti-corruption perspective specifically.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
disaggregated data for us is something that in the community we normally are looking for, because I mean, from dealing with the control of corruption index and whatnot, yeah, we tend to see a lot of global indicators that
Mhm.
hide a lot, so or makes it very difficult for us to then look at the more nitty-gritty aspects of the problem.
Yeah, I think that's really good feedback because our intention for this was to, I guess, to provide the two as a package, right? So you have the disaggregated information in a sense, this country has this type of regulation, not this one, blah, blah, blah. We can learn from this by, you know, looking at global trends and whatnot. But then on the other hand, we have the single measure where you can use it as a control variable or some form of in more of a large N approach. So if the data isn't in the data set, if that data isn't contained in the data set already, I'll make sure that we do add it because, as you say, we have it. So there's no point in keeping it secret, right? It should be out there for people to use.
Great, thank
Um,
you. I'm sure everyone here shares my happiness at hearing you say that the data may become available for this sort of future research.
Absolutely. We're very open with the fact that we want people to actually use it. Um, we have some ideas of things that we want to do, like papers and books and things, but we also want other people to use it and do things with it as well, right? And I think that's really important to be open and transparent with, particularly with data. The only way you can actually get people to use it is by, putting it out there. So certainly my website with my data, the first form of the data set is all up there, open access, ready to be downloaded whenever. We do plan to add the other data set to that website and make it more transparent and open access at a later date. It's more um, about time and actually having the time to do it. But if you want to email us and you want me, to send a copy of the data set, like please do. We're very open to that. So yeah, what we want to do is expand this over time, and it's comes back to what Walter was saying earlier about how these things tend to have like ad hoc updates every now and again. We want to be in a position where we can routinely come back to actually update these things, look into things like um, trends, changes, and try to really look into this corruption relationship and see if there is that element of time. Time's important for causation, right? So see if we can really provide a platform for someone else to um, look at that or to collaborate with us. So there are some limitations that I sort of touched on. It doesn't tell you whether these regulations are actually followed in practice, but how many have tried to do that and failed. So it's very difficult. It also doesn't take into account exact thresholds. So it will code €50 spending limit the same as $5 billion spending limit. But what we found is it's actually really difficult to compare these across contexts. You have different currencies. Some are increasing with inflation, some aren't, and it's just basically too difficult. So yeah, future room for improvement, but we very much see it as a first step, not the last. And hopefully, some within your network will be able to come with us on that journey, right? And develop further. So the final thing, the references are here. I can send this presentation round or links to this so that everyone has it. But yeah, that's everything. If there's any further questions, I'm more than happy to stay for a bit for further discussion.
Thank you, Will. Thank you for such a brilliant work that you and your colleague have done through both data sets, and especially I completely recognize the amount of effort that goes into building your own data sets, and the fact that you were able to do it for such number of countries. I mean, I have so many questions about the obstacles of the language barrier and actually like manually going through it. I've done for a few dozen countries, and I know that is quite exhausting, right? So kudos for that very much. So, which is also why I was asking you about the data set, because yeah, once it has been created, there's so much that can be done with it, right? And 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 I do recognize that, of course, there are other papers that you and your colleagues will likely want to work through. But by engaging here with the anti-corruption community, again, there are a lot of like questions that potentially you haven't mapped out yet, or they may be yet to be recognized by exploring the data with new eyes. So I certainly hope that some of our colleagues here today or later when they catch up this video via YouTube, that we get a significant amount of views as well for what the community is, of course. Hopefully they'll reach out to you and to explore further collaborations.
Yeah, I mean we're always looking for co-authors, always looking for collaborators. So don't feel free, just don't be worried to email me. You all have my details, and yeah, thanks a lot. It's been really nice to you have a very chatty, vibrant community, it seems. So, and I look forward to attending more from the other side in the future, right?
I certainly hope so. And thank you for again, I mean, donating your time, not just the 90 minutes originally agreed upon, but to stay with us so you can go through the presentation and introduce us to all this very interesting information. I don't want to take more of your time. Thank you everyone as well for joining us today. Please stay tuned for news about the future presentation they will have. Sorry, for what? You wanted to say something?
I'm just thanking you for all the effort. we are spending years now together.
That's right. Yeah, for what has been with us from the beginning. I can't believe that we're in our 4th year already. Well,
I just have one suggestion. I think that all of these sessions need to be translated into a book.
Oh, you know what? That's a very good point. I'm playing with the idea. So if anybody's interested to have that chat, please send me an email, and we can certainly have a call to see how that could take shape. That's an interesting point. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. I
Thank
hope
you.
you have
Bye.
a great day, great afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and hope to see you soon. Well, certainly for the next roundtable in February. Take good care.
Thanks, everyone. That's
Thanks,
great.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.